Lionel, is that you?
There, I think I got it. Dave?
Lionel.
Dave!
Lionel.
I'm so excited.
I am too.
It's part 2 of the Great Tony Koester Extravaganza.
I think that's a good title.
I think so. I actually have notes from the last time. I feel like, you know what? I was thinking there earlier today. I was thinking, man, this is kind of deep for me. And so try to stop me if I get carried away. You know how I have a tendency to talk, not like you, Dave.
No, I'm a quiet guy.
Yeah. So cut me off if you need to.
Okay.
But I was thinking about last time how we only got to like the end of the 70s. And then it dawned on me, the name Tony Koester has been part of my life for like 50 years. I was like everybody. Like I loved the hobby as a kid. Got into high school, kind of put it on the back shelf. But like every true model railroader that's been a modeler since they were a kid, and they take a little break or they don't take a little break, but it slows down, I think, for everybody there in the teens and early 20s. But it's always there, right? You see the magazine, you might grab a copy or two.
100%. I agree. Yep.
And I remember his name from, the early 70s, which means it's been part of my life for like 50 years.
It's incredible. And it's just as constant for me. I mean, I'm not that much younger than you, but there's definitely he's been one of the continuities through this hobby for most of us that currently are in the hobby, which is remarkable. It's an achievement.
Yeah, for you, it's been your whole life. He's been part.
Literally. My first model railroader would have been right about 1980, and Rear Model Craftsman shortly thereafter, because I got him at the same hobby shop in Chester, New Jersey, which is long gone now. The town, of course, is still there, but the hobby shop's gone. So yeah, it's an iconic name for me in the hobby, and so to be able to talk to him at length like this is a real pleasure.
Yeah, and I liked how last time we talked about the whole Alan McClellan thing, because that just changed. Once those two guys got together, put their heads together, it changed the direction of the hobby. It not that the hobby wasn't struggling before that, but it was one of those moments that pushed the hobby forward again. Just like, as the years have, just like recently, there's been a guy more often than not featured in Kalmbach publications. He's written a book. He's been on 2 covers. He's a big Conrail guy. I mean, he's pushing the hobby forward.
Yeah, but I have some wonderful mentors and some large footsteps to watch for a long time before I even crack that echelon. But hey, I'm having a lot of fun with it, and Tony's been a big part of the reason that I've been able to make some mistakes and learn from them. As have you. This has been a real blessing as things go.
I know you hate this kind of stuff, and we know for sure that you're not the absolute first, but your ventures into Facebook Live Saturday night at Dave's house, Facebook Live, you started doing it because of COVID, and Rich Winiski gave you the idea. You're the pioneer in that, and that's one of the things that it's kind of one of those events in the hobby. It's everybody's always going to talk about the beginning of that, and I mean, it's one of those things.
Well, it's again, to be able to contribute like this it's a dream come true. It's a lot of fun. Don't get me wrong, but it's certainly something, to be able to participate at this level is it's an amazing experience so far. I'm excited because we're just getting started.
Yeah. So we're only made it to the end of the 70s technically. And I have some questions that we kind of blew past. And so we got to ask those questions.
All right. Well, let's get him up here from the green room.
Okay, you go ahead and see if he's still there.
All right, Tony. Good to see you again.
Come on in, Tony.
Well, good evening, guys.
Good evening, sir.
Just grab the same seat there and plug your microphone in and get yourself comfortable, because we have a lot of hard-hitting questions for you tonight.
All right. I think I'm ready and comfy here.
Perfect. I have a question right off the bat from last time. So last time, is that correct? I feel like, is that what you feel like? We got it to kind of to the end of the 70s about see, I wanted to know the whole story. That was what made me excited. Is I was going to ask questions that nobody else asked. And I was excited to kind of be piecing all this together as we're going along. So I have a lot of questions tonight. But is that kind of where we got to? Don't you think, Tony? It was to the end of the 70s?
Yeah, I think that's where we were. I didn't take notes. I probably should have, but I think that's about where we were.
Yeah, you should have taken notes, because if you're relying on me to do that, we're in a lot of trouble. Dave?
Well, I remember we talked about the years at RMC as editor. We touched on that and some of the experiences there, and I had a couple things that we can certainly talk about, but I think the themes will come up later in the discussion, so we can hold back on those for now. But what I am interested, I remember that, Tony, you did make a change over to Bell Labs, which I think we alluded to the last time, but I would love to hear how that came about and what it was like to have worked in a editor's chair for one of the two big magazines in the hobby, and then to shift gears. How was it to go from your professional stance in the hobby to a professional stance someplace else, and then maintain a position in the hobby?
And I have part two of that question before you start, Tony. Because while you were telling us all about the 70s, you just blew past. At one point, you said you got national awards for writing.
That was high school.
Well, still, it doesn't matter. We kind of just blew past that. So in high school,
that's even better.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. So in high school, you wrote something that somehow got national awards for it or something?
Yeah, what I call the preposition group, the National Council of Teachers of English, gave me a first place award for a theme I wrote about Lake Michigan, sleeping in the winter. Our house in Long Beach, Indiana, was fronted up on Lake Michigan. And if you've ever lived near a great lake, you know how peaceful and beautiful they can be. And at the same time, you got to be wary because they can slap you right in the face when they're angry. So I wrote a theme about, the transition between one personality and another, and won this national contest. And the beauty of winning that contest was that it tested me out of freshman English at Purdue. And the importance of that was that I was an engineering major at Purdue, and all of the teachers of English were a bunch of, grad students, and their mission in life was to flunk all the engineers because they didn't consider us worthy.
I remember that well.
So they didn't get their hands on me. But what happened instead was I got popped into a senior or graduate level creative writing course. And so, suddenly there you are playing in the big leagues, wearing a little league uniform. And so I remember writing I learned some things there. I wrote a novel on two guys that were friends during college, and one of them wound up in the German Navy and the other American Navy, and you can guess what happened during the war. And the professor taught me a big lesson. He says, never write something that's based on coincidences. He says, that's just not a good premise. And so that was lesson one I learned. The other thing I learned was, in frustration with this guy, being a pragmatic engineer, towards the end of that course, I think I managed a C out of it, whereas I was getting straight A's in engineering. So he was dragging down my acumen. And so I asked him, I says, okay, here's the deal. I says, let's say that you write some great piece of literature and it's not recognized as such at all until 100 years after you die. And then suddenly it's realized that you're the next Shakespeare. But meanwhile, I start writing Mickey Spillane novels, and I'm rich. I said, which one of us is a success? Well, you can see how that came out. So we agreed to disagree, and I got my C and escaped with my life.
So has writing always been part of your life then? I think that's an important avenue to explore. Because you went to Purdue to be an engineer, and it seems like writing has been the main thrust of your entire adult life.
I've quickly discovered that I was not cut out to be an engineer. I was very, very good at chemistry. I should have been a chemie, I guess. And I was very good at math. I was horrible at circuit theory. I guess I went into double E because I was electrical engineering because I wanted to learn how to wire my model railroad, and that sounds like a joke, but I think it's true. But there were just facets of circuit theory that just left me absolutely cold. One of them being imaginary numbers that are part of AC current and stuff like that just didn't figure into my understanding of math. Math was an absolute, and suddenly here we are with square roots of -1, which is never was. You can't do that. So you wind up with an imaginary number in your equations, and the whole thing just left me cold. Well, meanwhile, a couple of us, two of us went to the dean of electrical engineering and said, we'd like to take art. I mean, real art, not art appreciation. He said, well, that's not in the track that you guys chose. And I said, well, we'd like to do it anyway. So he let two of us take art, and the two of us got the only 2 A's in art. And that pissed off the art majors. And but we were pretty good artists. And then I got into public speaking track. And one day I walked into public speaking class, and I looked in the classroom door, and half the football team was in there. And I'm thinking, oh, easy A. And the guy standing next to me says, you don't have any raw meat on you, do you? And I said, no, why? And he says, well, these football guys, you got to be careful. They'd attack you. And I recognized his voice as being the local DJ on WASK in Lafayette, a guy named Brian Lamb. And Brian and I became good buddies, and I did some radio work with him out at WASK, not for pay, but just pro bono stuff. And then later, after college, I was watching TV one day, and I saw this naval officer, because he was part of the ROTC program like I was Air Force, he was Navy. I saw this naval officer escorting one of Lyndon Johnson's daughters, and I said, Judy, that's Brian Lamb. And it was, and I said, wow, he's really done well. And then one day I turned on C-SPAN, and there was Brian Lamb interviewing somebody. And I said, my gosh, Brian Lamb got a job on C-SPAN. Well, no, he didn't get a job on C-SPAN. He founded C-SPAN.
I'll be darned.
So I hung around with the right people, and with my abilities in art and even mechanical drawing, I was always very good at it. And in fact, when I got into freshman mechanical drawing at Purdue, I knew more than the TA did that was teaching it, and I wound up teaching most of the course. So I always had this background, so I was very quickly informed that I needed to get into communications more and into engineering less.
Well, it's a natural fit. I mean, it sounds like a natural fit across multiple disciplines, which is a real privilege. But it was funny because I can really relate to that Tony story, because Syracuse is not Purdue. It's a much smaller engineering school. The engineering college there is smaller than that at Purdue, obviously by a long shot. But I can relate to being thoroughly confused by electrical circuitry. That was one of my most difficult courses as a freshman in engineering. But like Tony was talking about, even though I enjoy people and I can handle the math, I was never great at math, but I could study hard and work hard at it and get through it. That all changed when I got to, they called it, in my time, it was called Sequences and Series. It was a Calculus 3 level course where you talked about, square roots of negative numbers. You talked about, substitutions and differential equations, all of which remains well above my head. Even today, I got through there. I think I came out with a C-, and it was the best C- I've ever gotten in my life. I was very happy to get through there without a lower grade than that. And that's sort of what engineering, the interesting foundation of it, I think, and this is something that I can relate to with you, is that people used to say, well, you enjoy singing, you enjoy being in front of a crowd, you enjoy speaking. But if you can get that engineering degree, my dad always used to say, that's going to open more doors than, you can always take that and go someplace else. You're not going to be able to take a business degree and understand what the engineers are doing. And so I hung in there and got the civil engineering degree, but then was very happy to get opportunities in my career and in the hobby to do more speaking and working with people as opposed to numbers.
Well, that's what happened to me, was that when the days at RMC came to an end, in 1981, and thanks to a fellow named Dick Steinbrenner, I got an interview with a woman that headed the technical publications department. She saw the technical background that I had as well as all the publications background. The mix made me a perfect fit for the tech pubs department. And I went in there as a senior technical editor, which was as high as you could go without being in management. And that prevented me from having to crawl up the ladder. And within 2 years of that time, I was promoted to manage the group that I was part of. So that got me into management.
All right. So let's get down to brass tacks. Why did you leave RMC?
Well,
and remember, nobody's listening, so it's just the three of us.
This goes way back to two events that happened in the early 70s. The first one was there was a paper crisis, and we could no longer get the stock of paper that we had before. We were printing on 45-pound paper, as was Model Railroader, and we had to go down to, I think, 38-pound paper. Time and Newsweek were printed on 32-pound paper, so we still had a pretty good stock of paper. But at the same time, Kalmbach was printing on 45-pound, and they had decided to sell Kalmbach Printing Company, get rid of their presses, because they had these crappy old presses. And I had told Hal at that time, in the early 70s, I told him, I says, look, Kalmbach has got these old presses. They can't print 4-color anywhere in the magazine. They have to bind it in between signatures, which magazines are printed in 16 or 32 page signatures, and then they're bound together into however big a magazine that you want. And the only way MR could print color was to print the equivalent of a cover and bind it in between these signatures, whereas we were running on 4-color presses, and we could put color anywhere you wanted in the magazine. So I told Hal, I says, all we got to do is hire this guy that I had just left Lipton Tea. I says, hire Randy and get him out there selling full-color advertising, and we can get Kalmbach on the run. And Hal just wouldn't do it. He just wouldn't get off the dime on it. Phyllis later asked us if Jim Boyd and me, when we were complaining about this, he said, it ever occurred to us that Hal didn't want to be number one. Well, no, it hadn't occurred to us. But that was the early 70s. And so Kalmbach, by selling their printing company, had all these paper contracts. And when they got rid of the printing company, they had more paper than they needed. So when they lost a lot of their paper allocation, they still had more paper than they needed. So they could stay with 45-pound, and we went down to 38-pound. And so RMC suddenly looked, crummier than MR, to put it bluntly. But over the 70s, we started having a better cadre of authors than I think MR did at that time. I mean, we had people like Don Feeman and Doug Leffler and people like that, John Olson. And we also attracted people more than MR did, like Alan McClellan, of course. But we could get John Allen and then Bill McClanahan, who was strictly an MR author, but he entered the RMC Dremel Kit Bashing Contest, award contest, which I created with the Dremel people. And once he entered it, then all bets were off. I could ask him to do anything. And so we got people like that writing for RMC, and David Barrow and others. And so suddenly we had a really fine stable of authors, and RMC's circulation took off. And we went from 48,000 when I showed up in January of 69. When I left there in 1981, we were up to an average of 90-some thousand. And we had one issue that was up around 120-some thousand.
Wow.
And the magazine had been 48 pages or 68 pages, 2-color, black plus red or blue or whatever, when I came there. And we were had one issue of 168 pages, 4-color, when I left. But it was not sustainable because Hal had refused to make these adjustments. The only adjustment that he'd made really was hiring Bill Schomburg to give me some help. Now, Kalmbach had the staff of editors and a whole art staff, and doing all of that was Bill Schomburg and me. I mean, we did all the editorial work and we did all the graphic design work. We pasted up, that was hot wax days, where you waxed the back of the repro and pasted it down on a flat. And
wow.
No computer days. And, we designed the layouts. I did that. I was also the art director. So, we really worked our butts off, but it was getting obvious that we were not going to be able to sustain that. And Kalmbach had recognized the problem, and they had hired that ad salesman, a guy named Fred Hamilton, great guy, and gone out and sold the 4-color ads, just like I had told Hal we had to do. And they had done that. And so suddenly they were off and running. And so they recovered from the charge that we had made on them big time. And by 1981, I had decided that what we needed to do was to run a reader survey and find out what the hobby needed. And one of the questions was, what diesel do we need the most? And the answer was the RS3. Now, we need to go back to the early 70s again. Way before my time at RMC, slot cars appeared, and Irv Athern had panicked and sunk $100,000 into slot cars, thinking that trains were going to die. But it turns out that the sales hurt train sets, not scale model trains. And Irv essentially lost his investment and was really, really hurting. And Irv was from Connecticut. He was a Connecticut Yankee. And Hal gave him credit to run his ads until he could get back on his feet. But because he could not pay his bills, he was not able to run ads in Model Railroader. So that's why there was the ads in RMC for Athern for years, but not in Model Railroader.
Interesting. Wow.
And so Hal sent me out to see Irv Athern out in California. And at that time, they were in this really crappy building. It looked like some old warehouse. And you walked in the front door and it was like an army barracks.
Well, this is Compton, right? This is the original factory there in Compton, California?
I'm not sure whether it was Compton or not. I mean, I was so busy getting in and out of there alive.
Oh, sure. Well, right. And Compton became very, very much more notorious as the 80s went on, of course. So
this would have been early 70s. But
yep.
So I walked in there, and the Wicked Witch of the West was sitting at this desk, and, what do you want? And I said, well, I have an appointment to see Mr. Athern. Well, what I didn't realize is Irv often slept at the plant there. In his three-piece great suit, and his hair was all frazzled like Einstein. And she says, well, I'll see if he's here. And so at that time, Model Railroader started the magazine on page 3. There was front cover, page 2 was an ad, and then page 3 was their contents page. But in RMC, page 3 was the Athern ad. And Hal designed the ad, and it was red and black. With Hal, everything had to be red. And Hal took the pictures for the ad, and he'd shoot them with a Polaroid camera back on a 4x5 speed graphic. But the only thing you're supposed to do with a Polaroid back is to use that as a test. Then you're supposed to put real film in it and take a good picture. But Hal never do that. He just used the Polaroid picture, which was all gray and filled in. So if Athern come out with a new U-boat, Hal would build the U-boat, and the handrails were all crooked and everything. And he'd shoot this picture with this Polaroid back, and then he'd design this red and black ad. When Athern went to Model Railroader and they designed the ads, it was blue and black. The ads were much more attractive. But at any rate, there was this ugly friggin' ad on page 3 in RMC. So I was always wanted to figure out how to get that ad off of that page. So I showed up there, and she said, I'll see if Mr. Athern's here. And so he suddenly pops out of the back back part of the plant into the front lobby with his cigar. And he takes the cigar out of his mouth and he looks at me and he says, "Cancel my advertising." I said, "Really?" He says, "Yes, cancel my advertising." I said, "Well, that's great." I said, I was going to ask you if I could move your ad off of page 3 so I could put the table of contents there. But if you're willing to cancel your ad, that's terrific. He just looked at me. I'm sweating rivets. So then he just looks at me and he says, "You want to see the plant?" I said, "Yeah." I said, "Oh my God, I passed the test, you know." But I never did get that ad off of page 3. So at any rate, that's my meeting of Irv Athern. So now we go back up to 1981 and this survey shows up in the March issue or something like that. And it showed that we needed this RS3. But some reader had written in, "But don't have Athern do it because he's got these big motors and it'll make the hood too wide like he did on his Jeeps and the U-boats." And stupid Tony printed the letter. I can't imagine being naive enough to print that letter, but I did. And Irv Athern called Hal, I think this was March 12th, 1981.
Oh, boy.
Called Hal and reamed him a new one, you know.
Right.
So I had just that night the night before, had invented the puffball tree. Lee Riley, then of Bachman, the late Lee Riley, unfortunately, had sent me a box of polyfiber fill. And he said, "There's got to be a way to make bushes out of this or something. Play with it." So I played around with it a little bit. And Don Kassler had done the same thing in Pittsburgh, and unknown to me and unknown to him. And neither one of us had gotten it quite right, but we were both convinced you could make mountains of trees out of this stuff instead of using lichen. And so I was in Jim Boyd's office explaining to him how we just found a substitute for lichen. And Hal came into Jim's office and said, "I want to see you in your office." So I said, "Okay." So I followed him into my office and he says, "Look," he says, "I know what you're trying to do, but I'm just not comfortable with you trying to influence the industry and do all these things. I don't sleep well nights with, that kind of influence on the industry." In other words, he just wanted to make his dollar and go to sleep at night and not do anything that made waves, like No Time for Sergeants. Nobody rocks the boat.
Right. It's fascinating. Wow.
And so he said, "So one of us is going to leave, and since I own the company, I guess it's you." And my wife was working there too. She managed all the dealer accounts and trade shows. And so she stayed there for several years more, but I stayed out the rest of the week and got things in order. But that same day, Bruce Walters got wind of this. Of course, Hal talked to Bruce. And Bruce offered me a job at Walters, bless his heart. But I didn't want to surface somewhere else in the model railroad industry unless it was an MR. Little did I know some years later I'd wind up editing an issue of MR called Model Railroad Planning.
All right, hang on there a minute now. Now there's a lot of really good tidbits here, Dave, that we got to delve into. This is going to turn into like a 14-parter by the time we're done.
There's a lot of stories and a lot of names. I mean, again.
And a lot of great stuff that I've wanted to know all these years. Like, I feel very honored to have known Tony as much as I have over the years. I mean, we didn't always agree, but at the end of the day, you could never ignore the man's prowess and his contribution to this hobby has been. And I thought, man, this is perfect. I've ended up with his podcast. Now I have a reason to ask him like 1,000 questions. So you just said there, you didn't want to resurface in the hobby unless it was with Kalmbach. Now, did you have that thought in your head?
Well, I had interviewed at Kalmbach in the 1960s. They had a job opening for a draftsman staff artist, and I had gone up there and interviewed, and they'd offered me the job because I did have a good graphics design background, but the money wasn't adequate. Milwaukee is a very expensive place to live. I think it was the most expensive city in the United States when you compared the cost of living versus income at that time. And so I went home and, I said, geez, I just can't do it. George Gloff was the art director then. So he got a hold of me and he says, look, I'll make you the assistant art director if you'll accept the job. I said, you can make me vice president of art, George, but I can't come up there for that kind of money. And so that was the end of my model railroad career forever, as far as I was concerned.
Right. We talked about this a little bit last time, I remember, and I was surprised to hear that Milwaukee was the most expensive city in the country to live in, but you learn something new every day. But what an interesting turn of events to go from that to RMC, and then be told by RMC, who's at least in modern times is sort of seen as sort of a cavalier approach to the hobby and publishing, that you were changing the hobby too much.
Well, yeah, I have a couple.
That's remarkable. That is remarkable.
I have some great questions about that, but I want to. I've told Dave this story. I know I've never told you this story, Tony, and but I can remember when I built my new house and I built my layout room and everything like that, and I was sitting in my workshop and I was trying to build my version of, the Allegheny Midland and the Virginia and Ohio, and I can remember, and I told Dave this story. I can remember sitting there trying to pick out a paint scheme and going, well, I can't pick red and yellow because that's Allegheny Midland, and I can't pick blue and white because that's Virginia and Ohio. And if I ever end up on the cover of Model Railroader, I got to have a different color, blah, blah, blah. So my question is, so as you're kind of walking out the door of RMC, are you saying to yourself, someday if I ever get back into this game, I want to be with Kalmbach, period, end of sentence kind of thing?
Well, yeah. In fact, that was May of 1981 that I went to Bell Labs. And in 1985, I think it was, I started Trains of Thought. So obviously it was bugging me that I didn't have editor's notebook anymore, which I had created in RMC to have a place to share with readers. Hal still wrote his notes on an old timetable editorial, but I had all these neat experiences and stories to share with people. And so I created Editor's Notebook, and that didn't just suddenly stop when I quit being editor of RMC. I still got out and got, like Henry Ford said, get out and get under. I still was out and around, and it started bugging me. So I wrote a bunch of sample columns, I think 10 of them, when I finally got up enough nerve to do this. And both my wife, Judy, and Alan McClellan said, that ain't going to fly at Kalmbach. Neither one of them thought that I had a ghost of a chance to convince them. But Russ Larson was the editor at that time. And I hadn't burned any bridges at Kalmbach, although Russ and I had butted heads on one occasion. And Andy Sprandio and I had banged heads one time, but that had been water under the bridge a long time before that. And so I sent him 10 columns and sample artwork for the head of the column. And Russ said, yeah, I think we'd like to do that. And they used my artwork and the whole idea. I mean, just lock, stock, and barrel. Thought that was great.
I remember you telling that story at a clinic somewhere. And then when I came up with my idea for the column, I thought, I got to write 8 or 9 of these and send them in before I even suggested, because that's what Tony did. So thanks very much, because that was a lot of work. So now, Dave, I have a great question that you're going to want to be part of, or maybe I think it's great to judge this, but Dave, I think you're going to have your take on this question as well, because you're probably thinking the same thing as he's talking about. Walther's called him for a job. And then when he's talking about how Bachman sent him the bag of polyfiber and see if he can make trees out of it, and he invented the puffball tree, and it sounds like this is like he was at the epicenter of model railroading, and I'm wondering if
the cutting edge, even more than the epicenter. Yeah, sort of cutting edge. Well, yeah,
but not so much the cutting edge. Tony? Did you feel like you were in the center of this universe? It was for Bachman to ask you to try doing something with, because obviously that's where I learned how to make puffball trees or use polyfiber, was from you. And did you get this while you were in it? Did you get the sense that geez, I'm right in the middle of this thing. I have some influence. Not that that's important. It doesn't really matter whether you have an influence or not, but did you get a sense of you pretty much you were pretty much in the center of that universe? Like, did that make sense, Dave?
Yeah, I think I see what you're getting at here. I mean, I guess, Tony, if I could put my spin on it, would just be, how aware were you of being a leader in the hobby at that point? Because I would argue that, again, I'm born in 1977, so the first stuff I read in real time wasn't until the early 80s. And even then, I don't think I started to subscribe to Model Railroad probably to 85 or 86. So, you guys have a much larger worldview than I do of the hobby, but it seemed clear to me early on, or by the mid 80s, that yours was a name I saw all over the place. And even on the whispers of operations, when I would hear about that in one of the columns, or it was mentioned in one of the McClellan articles, the Allegheny Midland and Tony Koester were names that I recognized even as a young kid. So you were clearly a leader in the hobby, even at that point. I mean, what's amazing is that's 35 years ago. But what was your awareness level of that at that point? I think is that what you're trying to say, Lionel?
Yeah. What was your awareness level of that at that point?
I don't think I thought of it in those terms at all. I think this is probably a horrible analogy, but I think it was kind of like in the middle of a football game or maybe even combat, that you're just trying to get something done, and you're not really aware of how it measures up against something else. You can just sense that there's a certain thing that needs to be done. Maybe a good example of that would be Bill Darnaby's Maumee when he was designing the walk-around multi-deck railroad, and he said he absolutely knew that he needed a really, really good walk-around control system, and he probably needed a really good sound system, and he just expected technology to make it available to him when he needed it, and here comes DCC. And I think that's kind of the way we operated, it's just, we were pushing ahead on all fronts with the magazine. We were trying to make it better. We were looking for people who were doing things better. Alan McClellan and Steve King were close personal friends, so we were, and Jim Boyd was now on the staff as of 1973, and he'd been as 71, I think. So, he'd been a good friend even in the Midwest before I joined the staff. So there was a lot of input from people as to what was going on, and it was just a matter of almost trying to keep up with what was happening and going, oh, that's cool, we got to share that in the magazine. Oh, that's cool, we got to share that in the magazine. And I see that same thing going on today with model railroad planning. I have no idea what's going on at RMC or MR or model railroad hobbyists, but one of the things that I find the hardest with model railroad planning is it's an annual, and I see all these neat ideas that I'd like to share, and I only can share 11, 12, 13 of them with you every year. And I think it was the same way with RMC, but with a monthly, there was, much greater opportunity to share things. And the same thing happened in the basement, that if you needed something, you had to find a solution for it. And like the lichen thing lichen was okay. And then lichen covered with ground foam was better. And then, but even then, if it got mildewy, you had to spray it with Lysol. And then suddenly here comes polyfiber. There's got to be a way to use this. And then here comes command control. I mean, the Allegheny Midland was command control from day one, but it wasn't an ideal system, but it was better than most. Better than Astrac for sure. You just kept chugging along.
These layers, the layers that you build into it. And, one of the things that I've really tried to emphasize in my approach is to try and minimize doing things twice or three times. If there's ways to learn from mistakes and move forward, you can maximize the return on your time, for building a larger layout. And what I'm hearing the theme through, and for you, it's interesting because it's not just the layout, it's entire ideas of the hobby. I mean, to have talked to Irv Athearn and inadvertently woke him up to the fact that young kids weren't buying his engines because the cabs were too wide. Well, that was me. That's why I refused. I didn't want his GP9s or GP35s. They ran great, but they looked ugly. They didn't look like a GP35 to my eye, even as a young kid. And now I'm talking to Tony, who actually told the guy that.
Honestly, Dave, do you seriously remember that?
Yes, I clearly remember. Like, I don't remember the letter in RMC.
No. But you remember not buying those engines because of that.
Yeah, I actually got in trouble because my mom got me. I haven't told you this story yet, Lionel. My mom, when I was like 8 years old, my grandfather, they lived all over central New York and northern New Jersey. She had been born in Schenectady, but he worked for the sonar division of General Electric. His eyesight wasn't good enough to go into World War II. And so even though he had been in the ROTC himself, he ended up, working for GE on the sonar project all through the 40s. And then that, of course, continued after the war. So they moved all over the place. She was born in Schenectady in 1943. And then they moved out to Skaneateles, New York. And so she remembers being taken trackside by my grandfather, just to go up and watch trains on the New York Central. And they used to go to DeWitt. They'd go to East Syracuse, to the big roundhouse and turntable there and watch steam engines back and forth and what have you. So she knew New York Central. She was never a rail fan herself, but appreciated it through the eyes of her father and how much she enjoyed steam locomotives. So she got me one of the Athearn SDP 40s with the wide body that was lettered for New York Central. And I opened it on Christmas morning, and I was thrilled at first. And then I lifted it out of the box and looked at it and said, "Oh man, this one's too wide too." And it was bad. It was the worst I ever felt about how I treated my mom. She was all excited to get a New York Central engine for me. She didn't know what it was. No concept of that nobody ever had an SDP 40 because Athearn had all sorts of Fubu paint jobs. But she went to that hobby shop in Chester, New Jersey, which was called Pets, Hobby and Game. It was a pet store on one side, and it stank like animals. And then the other side was Hobby and Game, it was run by this really obnoxious guy who really had very little use for the model railroad crowd. He did RC cars, he did pets, he had some engines, and sure enough, she had gone there to get this thing. And boy, did I disappoint her when I pointed out that the hood was too wide. Anecdotally, so a sidetrack, but Tony, to hear. It's just in hindsight. Again, as a relative kid in the hobby, I'm sitting here listening to this, and I mean, I recognize everything you're talking about. I had lichen on my first layout, and then by the mid '80s, I saw the puffball trees, on the Allegheny Midlands in RMC and in Model Railroader, and started to play with that idea. But I didn't know where to get polyfoam, and the Pets Hobby and Game didn't carry polyfoam, and so I didn't. I cut up a pillow at one point and tried to paint it with my dad's house paint. That didn't work, because it just desperately trying to measure up.
Time out. You cut up a pillow?
Yeah.
Like off your bed or off your dad's bed or
no? What? It was one of the ones I didn't think my mom would notice. It was one of the ones that was in the closet. Yeah,
the famous last words. I didn't think my mom would notice.
Tony, yeah, and so it's. I mean, I'm sitting here laughing as I'm talking to you guys because, like, in hindsight, it's obvious that you were in the middle of it, right? But like, it's so funny to hear that. As things came up, you guys took advantage of it, and you networked. Well before the internet, you were networking with other model railroaders through the Purdue Model Railroad Club, and Darnaby, who was years behind you, people you met through the ROTC, and so on and so forth. And then, of course, applying to the magazines and getting an offer from Walthers. And it's just this is fascinating stuff, my friend. It really is.
Yeah, that's what I wanted. I wanted to ask all the questions nobody asked. But all right, so now we've okay. So did we get an answer from Tony, or is it just you and me talking?
I think the answer was no.
Okay.
They were doing the best they could with what they had. They pursued new ideas, but there was not. Yeah. It never occurred to him that this was a cutting edge or center of the hobby at the time when he was going through it.
Okay, so how did you? Okay, so you end up at Bell Labs. So you're probably like what 40-ish, early 40s at this point.
38.
Okay,
I would say.
Yeah,
probably.
And it was this office right there in Chester by the famous telephone pole farm, Tony?
No, I was in Piscataway And at first, that's where all the software development was done. If when you think about Bell Labs software, the 800 calling was all Bell Labs. Caller ID, three-way calling, all that stuff was done in Piscataway.
And that was Piscataway, New Jersey, which is, maybe a half an hour from where I live now and about probably an hour from where you live now. Correct, Tony?
Yeah, they're still trying to figure out where Piscataway is.
It's a big township.
It's one of those towns. It seems to be an old Indian name for, the white settlers can't figure out where it is either.
So what exactly was it? Because I've heard Bell Labs, or you talk about Bell Labs. I was one of those guys sitting in the clinics, listening to you and talking about Bell Labs. So what exactly? So you wrote an employee magazine, or you were the editor of an employee magazine for Bell Labs, or you wrote technical art? Like, what exactly was it you were doing there?
Well, I went there as a technical editor, which meant that I did computer manuals, but I had all this background in publication. So when they needed a textbook on queuing theory or a pamphlet or anything like that, I got that job. And then I wound up managing the group that did all these computer manuals for various software stuff. One of the biggest software groups in the country is the one that keeps track. You've seen those cables with all those color-coded wires in them.
Sure.
Well, the biggest software program with when you count the number of lines of code, was keeping track of all those friggin' wires. It's called Turks, Trunks Integrated Record Keeping System. And so we did all that stuff, and I managed a group doing that for a while. And then they needed a science magazine. And by this time, we had split away from Bell Labs because the Bell system had split up, and we'd formed a new company called Bell Communications Research, or Bellcore. And I had gone with that company because that was the company that stayed with the Bell operating companies like 9X and Bell Atlantic and those companies.
I remember Bell Atlantic, sure, yep.
And we were owned by those 7 regional companies. And so they asked me to found a science magazine. And actually, they hired a guy from, this is a funny story, they hired a professor from California to found this science magazine. Now, imagine an academic coming into New Jersey, from California, coming into New Jersey in what had been the world's largest corporation, and being a good fit, just square peg and round hole.
Oh, yeah.
And I kind of kept an eye on him for about a year, and I didn't see anything happening. And I'm like, how long does it take you to found a frigging magazine, man? These things are not hard to do. And so one day my boss called me in, and she says, Chuck's leaving the company. And I'm thinking, oh God, I'm gonna get this magazine. And it was much more fun doing software manuals because they didn't have this rhythmic deadline that keeps beating on you like a drum.
Sure.
On a rhythmic basis. She said, I want you to take it over. So I went into Chuck's office and I said, I understand you're leaving the company. He said, yes, I am. And I said, so what have you gotten done? And he said, well, and he hummed and hawed. And I said, well, you got a contract with a printer? Well, no. You got a contract with a typesetter. That's before we did our own typesetting like today on a computer. Well, no. And I said, well, what have you gotten done? He said, well, the boss gave me the most difficult article that's going in the first issue to write. And I said, well, you don't want to do that. And he said, well, she told me to do it. And I says, your job as a manager, not as a writer. And I says, if you take the most difficult assignment away from your senior editor, your senior writer, I said, and you make a mess of it, you're going to lose his respect and that of your staff. I said, give it back to your senior writer. Don't do it yourself and tell your boss why you're doing it. I said, manage the frigging function. Don't just do what you're told and like a sheep. I said, you got a function to manage here. You're not supposed to be sitting around writing articles. And he said, well, that's what she told me to do. And I said, well, I tell you what, Chuck, I says, we'll talk about that during the rest of the week. And he said, well, I'm actually leaving later today. I said, later today? and he says, yeah. And I says, look around the office here. Tell me what's actually yours that you brought in here since you came to the company. And he said, well, this and this. And I said, just put it in a neat little pile, would you? And he says, yeah. I said, can you lift it all at one time? And he said, well, I think I can. And I said, well, pick it up. And he lifts it up. And I said, follow me. I took him around the corner to security. And I said, throw this guy out of the building. Take his ID badge and throw him out of the building. I said, Chuck, you have a nice flight to California.
Wow.
I mean, just so I suddenly was editing the science magazine, and we had the company that designed the catalog for BMW in the United States for the art direction, and we beat IBM and AT&T and all the big boys in a competition in Manhattan for the best science magazine. So we did a really good job at that. And I did that for quite a while until we were bought out by Science Applications International out of San Diego. And they had their own PR staff and stuff like that. So one day the vice president came in and said, SAIC's got their own people to do all this kind of stuff. And if this was on a Monday, so if you're out of here by Friday, we'll put a year's salary tax-free on the table, and you can be out the door. And I said, if I'm out of here by Friday, and she says, yeah. And I said, well, how much should I get if I'm out of here by tomorrow? Because I was ready to go. Everything was collapsing, and there was only going to be 2 people left out of 60-some people that had been there before, and I didn't want to be one of the 2. So,
what year was that then?
That was 2001. And what was really cool about this was that we had a trip planned in 2002 to China for 3 weeks to get the last of steam. And it was a 3-week-long trip from Beijing out to... Beijing is like, if you think the United States and China as being about the same size as they are, and you think of Beijing as being roughly like where Washington, D.C. is, we went out to like where Kansas City is by train to get the last of steam out there, and then came back to almost to where North Korea is to get the last of steam in a coal mine, and did a lot of run around. We really nailed it thanks to Bill Darnaby and Bruce.
I was able to take that same trip. We followed right on your footsteps.
Bruce Meyer, I couldn't remember his name. Late Bruce Meyer.
Yeah, but I did it in 2005, and by that time they'd already stopped in a couple of the spots that you guys got to see. But we did get to see the final double-headed QJs on the mountain grades.
The Jingpeng Pass line was the key.
Unbelievable! It changed my whole. You and I have talked about that once or twice, Tony.
Yeah,
but it changed my entire concept of what railroading is. Absolutely life-changing trip.
But if I'd still been at Bell Labs, or what was then Telcordia Technologies, had undergone a third name change. When you're gone from the office for 3 weeks, people figure out that you don't do anything.
Mm-hmm. That's a fact.
That's very dangerous time to be gone. So I came back from, by the time I took that trip, I figured when I left Telcordia that, I had to find another 9-to-5 job, but, I had a 50-mile commute each way to Piscataway and back, and then it was reduced to 30 miles to Morristown and back. But, you need an all-wheel drive vehicle and stuff like that, and it's expensive. And when I started looking at cash flow, and, when you're working at a big company like that, you always contribute to the savings bond plan, and, you're putting money in there. But when you quit doing all those things and you quit paying for this second very expensive vehicle and all that stuff, and you get something that you much more modest, it turns out you don't need a lot of money unless you're planning to get rich. And so I got a hold of Kalmbach and said, I think that I might be able to do more work with you guys, and I already had a contract for a book that I'd done, and so they had by this time figured out that I would do a book for them every year if they pushed a little bit, and I had a contract to do model railroad planning, so that was 2 contracts, and they said, well, we'll give you another contract to be a contributing editor if you write your Trains of Thought column every month, which I was already doing anyway, and you write X number of features for MR and show up at the National Train Show and stuff. So that gave me 3 contracts with Kalmbach, which was a sum total of about the same amount of money as I was getting from Social Security, which in a few more years after I left Tilcordia I was going to be eligible for. So, I just put my head down and said, heck with this. I'm not going to 9 to 5 it anymore. I'll just be a model railroader for the rest of my life. And it's worked out. I did that in 2001, and here we are 20 years later, and it's worked out pretty well. I'm not rich, but it's worked out pretty well.
No, it gives me a lot to think about. There's a lot of perspective there, which I think is really important. And I think there's some, as a guy who's 44 with 3 young kids at this point, and but I worked for the railroad. I worked for the railroad for 22 years, and so like Tony, another 6, 7, 8 years here, there's some decisions to be made, and this is an interesting perspective that stuff some things I got to think about. But it's remarkable to hear, because we go from the early 80s to 2001, because Tony, like the rest of us that work at a big corporate job, whether it's a big railroad or whether it's a big technology company or whatever people do for work, and regardless of whether or not you moved up the ranks through the union and the labor, or you're coming in from the management side and you bumped around over there, you do blink and time does go by quickly. And this is the first conversation in a long time that I've had that didn't include some discussion of the 1990s.
Okay.
And it's an interesting perspective because Tony was working hard that whole time on his day job. Meanwhile, finding a lot of ways to contribute to the hobby, I think through other means.
We can talk about the 90s if you want. Were you a music fan of the 90s? Is that what you're trying to drive towards?
No. I love 70s and 80s music. No, there's the bands I liked in the 80s that continued through the 90s. I'm okay with that. But no,
okay.
it's just my people that are my age. The 90s that's when I went to college. Was
Sure.
the 1990s. And so again, the whole thing here is just a generation or so behind Tony. But it's an interesting, fascinating reflection. And then to think about, the way to work yourself through all these different spots. I mean, for the luck to have landed at RMC and then later to work yourself up into MR. I mean, there was a lot of model rarity magazines, at least from my perspective, in the 60s and 70s. And those are the 2 that remain, sort of the 2 flagships for the model rarity hobby, I think. And Tony's got extensive experience at both, which is fascinating.
Oh, yeah. So how do we get to... So you came up with this Trains of Thought idea, and nobody liked it. Your wife didn't like it. Judy, your wife didn't like it. And who else did you say you ran it?
Helen McClellan didn't think that MR would buy into it.
And so then you wrote 10 columns, and around this is all 19. So by 1985, they'd featured your layout in the magazine, right?
I think it was, I guess it was 85. It's only not appeared twice. It got bumped by a full-page ad early on twice, but never since.
So then you wrote these 10 columns, and Russ Larson was the editor, I guess, at the time.
Yeah, Russ was the editor.
And so what was their first initial reaction to it?
I just sent the 10 in to Russ, and Russ got back to me. He says, "It's a great idea. Let's do it."
Wow.
Simple as that.
It's awesome.
Yeah. And so then off you went.
Yep.
And have you ever, how many words is one of those columns roughly? 500 words?
I never count words. I count lines. I know when I'm on page 3, when I set the column width, that I got about 2 lines on page 3 that I can do, and that's the end of it.
Okay. So, okay. Well, that's something I've never heard. Like you count lines. So, like, wasn't it usually 3 columns? Like your actual trains of thought was usually 3 columns on the page, wasn't it?
Yeah, they changed the format around, so I quit chasing their format, and I just write it to what I know works. And Stephen Audie is my editor there now. I've gone through a half dozen editors, and Stephen is very, very good at making everything fit.
So over the years, okay, so we can't just kind of blow past this because trains of thought is huge in the hobby. I mean, lots and lots of people know what trains of thought is and have read it religiously and heard your stories. So I mean, we can't just blow by this. I mean, so you submit these columns. Russ Larson loves the idea immediately, so you're kind of probably shocked that it was so easily accepted, I'm assuming.
Yeah, I almost half expected a rejection, but I have always submitted. I would say there's probably, I don't know, 50 or 60 columns sitting there somewhere at Kalmbach. I don't write them once a month and submit them to a deadline because I don't, for 2 reasons. One, I never want to be late. You get sick or the computer dies or whatever. Neither of which have ever happened. But anyway, but the big one is I never ever want to put an editor in a position that he has to run this column because he may not like that column. And for whatever reason, or his boss may not like the column. And so I always try to give him at least 2 or 3 times more columns than they're ever going to need, so that if they, have a feature article on prototype modeling or something, and, they may remember, well, Tony wrote something about that they could tie my column into it or something. But mainly it's to not get the editor, the column editor, in a corner that he's stuck with his column that he really is not very comfortable running. They've never told me that they didn't want to run a column, but there's some columns that haven't run, and for whatever reason, I never put them on the spot and said, how come you never ran that column? I just don't do that.
So what happens? You're just kind of working on the layout, or you're at somebody else's place, or you're thinking about something and an idea comes to you, and you probably type really fast, don't you? Which is really annoying.
I'm a clumsy typer.
Although my new MacBook has the incredible dictation software. It's unbelievable how well it works. So are you trying to tell us, is this a scoop that we have? Are you trying to tell us that there's like roughly 40, 50, 60 columns at Kalmbach at Model Railroader that have never been published?
Yeah, that's probably true. I'd have to look, but there's quite a few. And every so often I go back. If Steve tells me, hey, the bin's getting a little low, what I may do is go back and find some that, I have categories of columns, ones that have been published, ones that have been sent, and ones that haven't been sent. And I look at the ones that have been sent to them but not published, and I look through there and see if some of them are kind of out of date, and think, well, that's still a pretty good topic, so I might refresh it and say this one, you might take a second look at it because it might even go back to a time before Steve was the editor handling my column. He may never have even seen it. And that's particularly true now that they're working from home and don't have quite the access to things that they used to have.
What would be great is all those unpublished columns being put in a book. People would snap that up. Or on the other side of the coin, I mean, if somehow they took a compilation of the greatest, it's been going now since 1985. So help me here, Dave, with math. That's roughly 35 years times 12. That's approximately 400 columns of trains of thought. Man, people would love to have the best of trains of thought in a book of some sort or something like that. People,
I agree with that.
We did that in my last book, I'm trying to remember the name of it. Hang on a second here.
I think the name of your last book was Things I Would Have Loved to Have Done with Lionel.
Yeah.
We haven't even gotten to those stories yet, by the way.
What stories? There are no stories.
I still love that Marty McGurk story.
Which one is that?
Okay, the book, Applying Lessons from the Prototype, that book started out as a proposal to do just what you're suggesting. And what it wound up being was I took columns that had the theme about prototype modeling some way or another, and I would take 2 or 3 columns that were kind of related and combine them into one chapter. So that latest book, the one that came out last November, is really Trains of Thought rewritten with a whole bunch of new illustrations. But it's not the book that I proposed in the first place, which was a Trains of Thought Revisited or something like that. So maybe someday we'll still get back to that.
So do you remember your favorites of do you remember your favorite columns at all?
Well, I wrote one about my dad dying that got probably more feedback than anything I'd ever done. It was about, all the questions you should have asked your dad and you never did.
Right.
And that got tremendous amount of feedback. But again, it's kind of like the earlier question about remembering that or knowing that you were in the center of the hobby or the forefront of the hobby. It's just you just write the next column and move on.
I get that, but you must have had a sense of, okay, I get it. Let's try to attack this question from another stance. So, first off, we've got to make sure we cover the 35 years of Trains of Thought. Like where would you even begin other than you've been doing it for 35 years? You have 40 or 50 or 60 columns that have never been printed. Like, you just write these whenever the mood strikes. And you don't do words, you do lines. I just still don't understand that. So, like, as you've been going along doing this Trains of Thought thing, you must have some sort of sense of how much people enjoy your contribution to the hobby. How about that?
Well, I get feedback, and fortunately, with the exception of 2 guys, it's been generally positive. I mean, I do get emails that I very much appreciate saying, I don't agree with that point, but I appreciate you making it. But there were 2 guys.
Okay, me and who else?
I had 3 guys.
Probably me. Probably me. There we go.
There was a guy on Long Island that kept busting my chops, and I couldn't figure out what his problem was. But it turns out he didn't get staging. I finally figured out what his problem was, that he just didn't understand this idea of a model railroad needing staging. He just wanted his trains to go around in a circle where he could see them. And anything that I wrote that had anything to do with beyond the basement, to use a McClellan term, really wrapped him up into a ball of fire. But the guy that I most enjoyed dealing with was a Colonel Wiedekind out in California, who I don't remember what his problem was, but he got really upset with me over something. So I thought, well, okay, I'm sorry I upset you. So I sent an Allegheny Midland hopper car to Kalmbach so that they would send it on to him, because I didn't want to give him my home address. And I also felt that he'd be more comfortable receiving something with a business address on it than a personal address. So Kalmbach mailed him this hopper car with my personal letter inside of it saying, please accept this as a token of my as an apology for upsetting you like that. Well, Kalmbach got this thing back saying that I never open any package that I have not personally ordered out of security reasons.
Boy, that sounds like somebody from today.
So,
okay, bud. All right.
So I just gave up.
That's the end of that.
Those are the only two guys that I have absolutely certain that I really wound their watches.
Do you have, so the editors you worked with Russ Larson and primarily Andy Sprandio. Russ Larson was, I don't know what, till the middle of the 90s, maybe? Late 90s, early 90s, I think, something like that. And then Andy Sprandio. And you were pretty good friends with Andy, I think, weren't you?
Yeah, we got off on the wrong foot.
Did you?
Yeah, we were working together for when he was not an editor at MR, but and I was working at RMC. But then David Barrow sent an article on his Cat Mountain and Santa Fe to RMC, and this followed the V&O story. And then Andy got hired at MR, and so he got a hold of David because he was one of David's pals down in Texas. And so he told David to withdraw the article from Model Railroader and or from RMC and send it to MR. And I'm not going to name the other railroad that was involved here, but David said, well, let's see, do I want to have my article featured in the magazine that ran the XYZ railroad, or do I want to have my railroad featured in the magazine that ran the V&O story? I think I'll leave it with RMC. And, of course, that ticked Andy off to no end.
Oh, wow.
And about that time, there was, I think there was a photo in the Cat Mountain article that I thought was Andy's photograph. And it had a technical problem with it. And I sent it to Andy with a note, an RMC letterhead. I sent it to Andy with a note saying what was wrong with the photograph. And I said, now that you're professionally in the business, watch out for that because, and I got this letter back from Andy saying nobody at Model Railroader needs any advice from anybody at Railroad Model Craftsman.
Oh, zoinks.
But we later became very, very good friends. Every time I went to Kalmbach, we'd go out to lunch together, and I took Andy and Arlene, his wife, out to dinner and when I was there, on business and stuff like that. And we went to the opera together, the three of us. And we were very good friends right up to the very end. Within, a month or two of the end, we were together.
Right. Yeah.
So,
my favorite Andy Sprandio story, because he wasn't particularly a talker. He wasn't. He would not talk your ear off, and but he was always kind to me. I never had. I really never have a bad word to say about him. I mean, I'll never forget when I did the layout that appeared on the cover, and I had chopped it up, and he called me he literally called me the day after I'd chopped it up and says, oh, we want a different picture for the cover. And I go, sure. And then like 2 hours later, I'm thinking, I got no choice. I got to tell him I cut this thing up. And I was like dead stone silence for like a minute on the other end of the
Wow.
And he's like, finally he goes, why did you do that? And I says, well, I couldn't get it out of my basement, and I was like tired of the thing. And he's like, it was like the shortest conversation we ever had.
Yeah.
But I always like to make fun of myself. I always like to make fun of myself and make jokes about myself and stuff like that. And we were at some convention somewhere, and there was a gang of guys, and they had started making jokes at my expense. And I remember just saying to Andy offhandedly, I said, I don't like that. I said, it's okay for me to make jokes about me, but I said, I don't like it when people start making jokes about me at my expense. And I didn't really think much of it until I don't know, maybe 6 months later. We were at some place and we sat down to dinner with a bunch of guys, and somebody started making some joke, making fun of me. And Andy just immediately said, hey, we're not doing that. We're not. If Lionel wants to make fun of himself, that's fine. But he says that's not our. That's Lionel's. We're not doing that. It was just the way he did it in such a deliberate and very kind, a very humanitarian way. It really meant a lot to me. It was a really cool memory to have of somebody.
I got to tell you a Lionel story that Lionel, I don't think, knows. Lionel and I were both at a NMRA regional down in Morgantown, West Virginia. Remember that?
Mm-hmm.
Sure. I saw Lionel was the after dinner speaker, and after dinner speaking is hard. I mean, that's probably, it's a lot harder than a clinic because you got wives to entertain, and there's a lot of things can go wrong with the AV and all that stuff. It's just hard. In fact, I make a point of not using AV for after dinner talks because, invariably it gets screwed up. But I saw Lionel was the after dinner speaker, and so I got a hold of him. I said, "How'd you get trapped into that?" And he says, "I volunteered. I called up and said I'd do it." Really? I thought, well, Lionel, you're going to get yours. I mean, that was my thought. So I'm sitting down at dinner, and Lionel's introduced, and he's going to be the after dinner speaker. And I'm sitting there, frankly, waiting for him to go up in flames. And he gave this talk about a tour of the Kalmbach building and driving a lift truck around the warehouse and all that. One of the absolute best after dinner talks I've ever seen in my life. And that's when my respect for Lionel went up 100% right on the spot. I thought, the guy is absolutely qualified to be doing this stuff. He knows what he's doing. That was an excellent talk. And ever since then, my feelings for Lionel have been elevated tremendously. I thought this guy really is as good as he thinks he is, because he pulled that off beautifully.
My favorite Tony story is happened just a few years ago at the Cleveland National Convention, and I was walking around the aisles. It was the first convention I had my little portable thing, and I'm walking around, and you came up to me, and we had one of the nicest conversations. You were so respectful and complimentary about all the things I'd done in the hobby. It made me feel like $1 million. Just made me feel like $1 million. That that here's this guy that's been around the hobby forever and ever, and I've always felt like, you were kind of like my Wayne Gretzky in the hobby. It's like, geez, if I could ever get half as many goals as Wayne Gretzky, I'll be doing as good as I could possibly ever dream of. And it was nice that it really meant a lot to me that you came. I have a great memory of Andy and a great memory of you, and I appreciate that very much. But that's why I wanted to do this, because you have a ton of stuff to tell people. So now I have a couple of, first off, Dave, I'm like thinking I'm missing 1,000 questions here, but I mean,
this is the whole thing is just incredible to listen to. I mean, again, both the camaraderie that you guys talk about, and look, everybody has differences of opinions. We're human beings. We're in a hobby that's intensely personal to most of us, and you're going to have a different view of other people sometimes. But the stories that you guys are relating really help to illustrate, I think, for everyone listening, that it's not about anything besides coming together to have a good time. And there's a lot of smart people in this hobby, a lot of gifted people, a lot of passionate people. And, you listen to these stories where Lionel gets up and volunteers for the toughest speech to make at one of these conventions, because there's a whole, Tony, I guess you'd mentioned to me at one time, somebody had opted out, and Lionel sort of came in to bail that out at the last minute and volunteered to help out.
Yeah, it was something like that.
And then you run into each other, at one of the national conventions, and so on and so forth. And you can just hear this is just leaders of the hobby that are happy to be there and they love what they're doing. And there's so much good energy that comes out of that. And I think, for me to be able to sit here and listen to you guys talk about these things and sort of reflect on it myself, that kind of leadership carries a tremendous weight for me, because that's for a lot of us that don't have railroad families, and that didn't get lucky with the Purdue Model Railroad Club. These stories that are related through the pages of Model Railroader and Railroad Model Craftsman, and now other sources online, Facebook Live, or this podcast. AML is a big piece of it. And you can hear the coming together and the fact that the best stories aren't you by yourself finishing a model in the basement.
That's true.
The best stories are about the people you meet along the way and the way that our paths interact and cross. And I sort of feel like in the last couple of years, largely thanks to Tony and to Jerry Dietzig's, urge and push, and then good hard mentoring and guidance on how to write for the hobby. I've always loved writing, but writing for the hobby it's a different animal. And Tony and Jerry have both meant a lot to me with that, and Lionel too, given it the push over the top, especially with this book. There's just a lot of great resources for people out there to tap into that energy, and you guys are accessible. You guys are you've got hundreds of places you can go and read what you guys have written. And it's just a really exciting time because so much of this stuff is at our fingertips. But to hear that, I love that you guys have known each other for this long and that you've seen each other at these events and the paths cross. It's fascinating.
My other favorite Tony story of all time is I wanted to get these guys into my basement so that I could get their advice. And I thought, well, I'll just have a convention and then I'll invite them to be clinicians and pay the freight and everything like that. And then one of the guys that worked for me, his wife owned a limo company. So I got them here a day.
This is the Marty McGurk story, right?
Well,
yeah.
To me, it's the Marty McGurk and everybody that was involved story. So I hired her limo for the day. And I'm thinking, I'll just take these guys around the Toronto area in a limo. And Marty, who, so we walk out to the front of the hotel, and I haven't told them about the limo.
Of course. Well, because you're Lionel, and that's how you roll.
Yeah, because it'd be a lot more fun. And so I hadn't told them about the limo. And we get out to the front of the hotel, and she's there. And I told her that I had told them. So I said, we're just going to get in, just like as if I'm just barging in. So we get out to the front of the hotel, and I'm like, so should we all go in the same car or whatever? Or what do you guys think we should do? And they're kind of looking at me like, well, don't you have this all planned out? And I'm like we could go in two cars, but we're going down to Toronto, and that's like 40 miles away. And, oh, wait a minute. Why don't we just go in this limo? So and they're looking at me like, well, no, that's for somebody else. And I'm like, no, and I'm like, I'll just get in this limo. Let's just get in this limo and see if they're available. So I climb in the limo, and they're looking at me like, we're not with him. And I'm like, come on, guys, it'll be okay. Come on. And finally, I had to tell them I'd rented the limo, and we tooled around Toronto all day, going to hobby shops and that in this limo, which was just the greatest. It was and we'd pull up to a hobby shop. The one I remember in particular was the Streetsville Credit Valley Hobby in Streetsville. And I said, okay, here's the order that we're going to get out of the limo. And I said, it's going to be me, then Marty, then Alan, and then Tony. And you could see that, we wheeled up and we pulled right up, and there was a spot. We pulled right up in front of the hobby shop. And of course, it's a limo. So then you can kind of see people looking out. So then I climb out, and I can see that people, and they're like, oh, it's Lionel. He's got his rented a limo. And then Marty gets out, and the eyebrows go up a little bit. And then Alan McClellan gets out, eyebrows go up a little bit more. And then Tony gets out, and they're like, oh, my God, the Beatles have just arrived.
I think it's just fantastic. Yeah. I really do. I mean, I would be standing outside the limo, too, going, what, are you kidding?
When we got up to Barrie, Lionel gave us one of his cars, which was a driver's training car. And I was driving it, and it had big driver's training signs all over it. So, of course, I found a one-way street and went down it the wrong way. And Alan was about ready to have a heart attack. I said, don't worry about it. If a cop stops, we'll just say I'm a practice driver.
Yeah, exactly.
So we had fun with that car, too.
Yeah, and I said to Alan as they left, I said, just point a lot. That's all you got to do is just point a lot, like you're giving instruction. So I don't want to put you on the spot. Oh, I know what I wanted to ask you before we go on to the next. We got like 1,000 more questions. So how do you stay motivated?
Well, here I am sitting here in a comfy chair, not doing anything on the model railroad. So it's
right.
But I'm finding that there's an issue in that general direction that's called writing. I'm finding that the creative rewards from writing books and editing and preparing a magazine are very, very similar to those rewards that come from building a model railroad. And so the first 3 months of each year are spent doing my next book, and the second 3 months of each year are spent intensively doing the next issue of model railroad planning. So as of July 1st, which is coming up right away, I'm usually free and clear except for some proofreading of my next book and the next MRP. So I don't get much modeling done during the first part of the year. The only thing I've really gotten done on the railroad is I'm starting to install a new telephone system between the dispatcher and the two operators, and that Seth Newman designed using some authentic nickel plate scissors phones. And I've installed a lot of that super expensive JTT corn that looks real nice, but boy, is it cost per acre.
It does add up.
I call that negative farming. And I just got a $300 box from Micromark full of the stuff yesterday, so I got to go plant some more. But at any rate, now the second half of the year should be a lot more open, that I can go do more of that. Normally, we do a lot more traveling in the second half of the year. Last year, of course, was a washout with COVID, and you'd think I would have gotten a lot of modeling done. A lot of guys did, but I never seem to get a lot of modeling or any leisure time stuff done when something's hanging over me. You know, I like the decks clear before I push ahead, and with all the dangers and stuff with the COVID pandemic and that stuff, it just weighed heavily enough on me that my enthusiasm was down. And I'm old enough now that if I allow myself to get into a comfy chair, it's hard to get out of it. And so I'm hoping the second half of the year will be better. We're going to start operating sessions again in August, and there's 2 or 3 of them scheduled for the remainder of the year. Some of them are not going to happen because of interference with holidays like Christmas. We usually operate on the fourth Sunday, but I'm seeing other guys, you know, their reports online about what they're getting done, and I'm feeling that I'm just not getting as much done as the next guy. But somehow there comes a time when I feel a switch flip on, and suddenly, bam! I'm off and running, and I'm hoping to hear that click any day now.
So over the last 20 years, when you've been doing this full time, and you work on the first 3 months of the year on a book, and the next 3, so were you pretty much you'd work on it like 7-8 hours a day, like you were that disciplined, or?
Are you talking about the book or the railroad?
The books and the publishing.
Well, I'm very disciplined with that. I can't stand a loose end relative to a deadline, and on top of that, I took over the publication of the Nickel Plate Society's quarterly magazine. I was the co-founder of the Nickel Plate magazine back in 1966 and published the magazine back then. And we had a succession of very good editors and art directors since then. And we had a good editorial team that lasted over about 10 years, but they are even older than I am and retired. And there was just nobody qualified to pick it up and run with it. And I can do that kind of stuff in my sleep. So every quarter I got this 32-page full-color magazine to produce. I don't have to do the graphic design work. That's done by White River Productions out in Illinois. But I do the Photoshop work on the images and all the editorial work, and find all the articles and do all the editing and formatting and all that stuff. So that takes a big chunk of the time that I used to spend model railroading. So things I used to do myself, I either have to job out or they just don't get done. But right now, I recently acquired another key brass Burke, and I have it down at a friend's house being rebuilt, not as a favor. I mean, he's being paid for it. And I picked up another 4 or 5 nickel plate cabooses and another dozen freight cars recently to get some of the blue box cars replaced. So things are happening, but one of these days I've got to decide that enough is enough. I've written about putting a best if used by date on the railroad. I'm not ready to do that yet. But you run the risk of sticking your spouse with the dismantling of the railroad. We've had cases like Harold Worthwine's railroad where a good friend stepped in and did the dismantling work, and there's people around that would probably help Judy, but I'd rather not put that burden on anybody. I took down the Allegheny Midland with the help of Perry Squire and Stan White, and it was a friggin' nightmare, and I'd rather not. A double-deck railroad's twice as much fun doing that. So.
Oh yeah.
And why was it a nightmare taking it down?
Oh, it's just you think you're going to save parts of it and stuff, and you suddenly wind up you're up to your knees in plaster and wood and wire, and it just is a disaster. So.
Yeah, it's an ugly job for sure.
It is a hard job. Okay, Dave. So we're running out of time on this one. So what should we ask him next? I'm anxious to ask him about. And I don't know how to word this correctly because I'm Lionel and I don't. But I'm dying to ask a question as blunt as, of all the model railroads you've seen, I mean, you've probably seen hundreds, and you've certainly operated on dozens and dozens and dozens and dozens and dozens of models. Can you give us your top 3 so that nobody is offended, or top 4 or something like that so that nobody's offended? I mean, do you feel comfortable kind of giving us what's your favorite, or better yet, how about if we attack it this way? Am I rambling, Dave?
No, operations I think is an important part, a growing part of the hobby that all 3 of us love. It's certainly something I grew up. That was always the reason I was really looking into model railroading. I love trains, but the operation to me has always been fascinating. It's why I work for the railroad. So yeah. So if you look at the top. What are 5 of your favorite operating railroads, Tony?
Well, I don't know whether I can come up with 5, but the most challenging and realistic one is probably the La Mesa Club out in San Diego. That is the singular most realistic setting in terms of scenery and operation of any model railroad, I think, on the planet. It can operate in a couple of modes, but if you get out there in timetable and train order operation, you're definitely immersed in real prototype-based railroading. Probably second to that is Bill Darnaby's Maumee. That is another place to learn the ropes of timetable and train order operation. Jack Ozanich's Atlantic Great Western Eastern, AGE, still exists. Jack died not too long ago. The railroad still exists.
Still exists?
Oh, yeah, and it'll probably be operating again. He deeded the house to a trust or something like that.
Really?
So,
wow.
And the outdoor railroad might as well. It was always an honor and a privilege to operate on McClellan's, Virginia, and Ohio. 1.0. I didn't really have a chance to get that comfortable with 2.0 in their new home before it had to come down. But just there was a certain ambiance to the V&O that you just couldn't deny. I mean, there was just it was just an honor to be around that. Anything Doug Tagsold does is always a worthwhile adventure. I mean, he started with the I think it was Denver Front Range and Western, which was DNRGW.
I still have all the issues where that was in MR. That's one of the reasons I loved the Rio Grande, were those articles.
Yep, and then he had the ON3 Railroad, which was in the basement of the mortuary, but when he sold the house and the business, he had to sell that. But that's been rebuilt now and expanded slightly, and we'll talk about that in the next year's model railroad planning. So that still exists. And then he had the Toledo Terminal type railroad in the new house a few blocks away. And of course, now he's got this 1 to 72 Colorado and Southern Railroad that I've operated on. So anything Doug does is fun. It's getting close to completion, which means there's got to be another railroad coming down the line.
He's amazing. The amount of stuff that he is able to create over time and the quality of each one of these things. Because, when I saw the Rio Grande, again, growing up in the Denver Front Range and Western, and I just fell in love with the kit bashing that he was doing to represent modern locomotives, in the 80s and in the early 90s. And then I blink my eyes, and a couple years later, there's this Toledo Terminal. There's a Conrail B23-7 on the front. And I said, Doug Tagswell, is that? Wait a second. I went back through all my issues until I found the one for the Denver Front Range and Western. And I said, you've got to be kidding me. Like this guy can model the Rio Grande or Conrail, and it's totally plausible. And Conrail's one of my favorite operations, but my favorite railroad, as you guys both know, is the Rio Grande. So I said, I got to meet this Doug Tagswell, and I finally got a chance to do it at the Rio Grande convention in 2018 I was there with Mark Hemphill, and I finally got a chance to meet Doug, and that was an honor because it's a guy I've looked up to for a lot of years for sure.
If you guys talk to him, will you put in a good word for me? Because I used to operate there on a pretty semi-regular basis. I took my crew down there, and then he got mad at me for some reason, and I don't know why. And he won't even be on the podcast or nothing. So I did something, and I made him mad. I think it's because we went around a traffic circle 2 or 3 times one day, and he didn't want to, and I just kept driving around this traffic circle. So it was something.
You're always rabble-rousing, Lionel.
I am. That's what I do. That's what I do. I rabble-rouse. It's why I was put here.
The one qualifier that I should put into my favorites so that people don't feel left out is that I'm a mainline guy. There are people who prefer switching layouts, and my buddy down the street from here, about a mile down the road, Perry Squire's got this beautiful Pittsburgh Shawmut Northern Railroad set in 1923 and operates like a Swiss watch and all that. Every train does work along the road, and it's a real pleasure to operate that, as Dave will confirm.
Absolutely. Yep.
So I don't want to leave that out, but I'm more of a high iron guy. I would say the average model railroader prefers a train that does a lot of work. Let's call it a local or a through freight that does a lot of work. I'm kind of a high iron guy that likes a freight that's dealing with timetable train orders and fighting its way over the main line. So that gets me to the nickel plate and the Malmy and the not the Batavia Club, but that was one of the
La Mesa
pioneers.
And La Mesa too.
The
Yep.
La Mesa Club. And Jacko Zenich's railroad had a good mix of that too. So, that is a filter that I put on any choice of model railroads that people should be aware of.
Jacko Zanich was awesome. He was just awesome. I mean, I operated there 2 or 3 times, and I think it was the second time I was there. Yeah, because it was at least 3 times, because it was the second time I was there. He couldn't get his tractor started. And for some reason or other, I said, I bet you I can get it started. And I went and looked at it, and I had enough knowledge of tractors, and and he goes off doing something with the outdoor railroad. And after about a half an hour, I got the thing fired up, and I thought, man, he was just thrilled with me. But which didn't matter, because when I was operating his railroad and I would screw up, I loved it. He'd come along and
Oh
yeah. You got. He was a railroader, and
but he did it in such a fun way. You thought he was serious, and then you realized it was just part of the whole thing. He was just yelling at you for like driving around the traffic circle. He just loved to rabble rouse and give you a hard time.
Jack explained that to me. He said that he loved railroading so much, and he was disappointed when he saw somebody doing something that showed that they weren't paying enough attention to appreciate that love for railroading that he had. That was the reason he got feisty.
Yeah, I loved it. How did you meet Perry Squire?
That's a great story.
Well, now hang on. we have a rule here, and I think we told you last episode that we decide whether the stories are great. So carry on.
That's right.
Yeah.
This is an interesting story that has the potential of being great. UPS guy delivers a Walther's box to me, and he goes, "Oh, another one of you guys." And I said, "What do you mean another one of you guys?" There's one down the street. And I said, "I don't want to know anything about it because I figured the guy had a Tyco train set." So a month goes by, and Harold Worthwine calls up, and he says, "I'm picking you up Saturday morning." I says, "Where are we going?" He says, "Dave Olson and me and somebody else, I think, are going down to Perry Squire's." And I says, "What's a Perry Squire?" And he says, "He worships the ground you stand on." I said, "I'm not going." He says, "Yes, you are." He says, "I'm picking you up at 9 o'clock. We're going down there." So we go down to Perry Squire's, and he's got this estate and this beautiful home and 20 acres and all this stuff. And we go down in this guy's basement, and he had this model railroad that was sitting in the middle of the basement floor and took up like 10% of the footprint of the basement floor. And it's not that big a basement to start with. And so what are you modeling, Perry? So Pittsburgh Sawmill Northern. Where'd you get the track plan? It was a plan that was in Model Railroading magazine that Bob Schleicher drew, which alert number 1. And he added all the plywood was there, but there was like 3 hidden staging tracks, 6 inches underneath a layer of plywood. And he says, "So what do you think?" "Well, you got to be polite." So he said, "Well, nice start." He said, No. He said, "I mean, is this a lifetime project?" So everybody just kind of froze. And then I think I was the one who said, "No, you're not even close." And so then Dave Olson stood in one corner and says, "It needs to be around the wall, and you need to have a peninsula, and the room's square, so the peninsula needs to be on a 45-degree angle, and da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da." So within a day or two, this railroad's in a dumpster. And within a month, Perry calls me down, and I take Jim Boyd down with me, and he shows me this track plan. And the track plan is essentially what he did today, except the yard at St. Mary's did not really resemble the yard at St. Mary's, Pennsylvania. And Jim Boyd was with me, and we pointed that out to him. But he shouldn't have listened to us, because by doing the yard correctly, it became a reach-in nightmare. But at least it looks right now. And he's got hatches that let you get in if things go wrong, and his track work is so good that things usually don't go wrong unless somebody screws up. So at any rate, that's how I met Perry Squire. And so he came down, or no, he didn't. He said, "I want a hand lay track. How do you hand lay track?" And I said, "I'll come down." So he had hand laid one switch on a test section of roadbed, and he'd done a pretty decent job, except the proportions of the guardrails and stuff like that were wrong, the wing rails. And I said, "Let me lay one turnout here in the yard." And I did that, and bingo, he laid the whole railroad. And the same thing happened with Harold Worthwine. He came down one day and said, "How do you hand lay track?" And I showed him how I was hand laying one turnout in the Ridgely and Midland County Yard in Midland, West Virginia. And he said, "Oh, that looks easy," and went home and built the railroad. So that's how I met Perry Squire, and we've been good friends ever since.
What year was that?
Oh, Lord.
Like 30 years? 30
I'm not good at that.
Okay, never mind.
Was it when you were still with RMC, or was it after you went to Bell?
Oh, no. This was, I was with Bell by this time.
Okay, I'm going to ask a Lionel question. Dave, get ready. I'm going to ask a Lionel. It's one of my favorite parts of the podcast, is just asking blunt. Not that I'm a particularly blunt person, but, Dave,
I can't. It's your podcast, so I know we can't withhold judgment on that one.
Dave, you and I have had some private conversations where we've been blunt with each other.
We have, and those are. I don't know. That's the way I am too, to be honest, and I appreciate. That's how I learn the best. So
yeah, exactly. So, Tony, you have not a reputation, perhaps, or whatever, of being blunt about people's track plans and what they've done and stuff like that. It's one of my favorite memories, one of my absolute favorite memories of all time, of Keith Thompson. God rest his soul, was a great guy. He was an associate editor at Model Railroader. I love that man to death. He passed away from cancer at age of 55. And someday I'll tell you guys, I'll tell everybody what he said once that later on turned out to be very valuable information in my own life. So I had somehow him and I had got my track plan to you, and you went all over it, and you had marks going every which way and this way and that way about how I should change things and this and that and the next thing. But you have a reputation of, when it comes to track plans, just being blunt and saying, look, you got to do this, or you got to do that. And have you always been aware of that, or has that been something you've done on purpose, or is it just mean that much to you that you want people to do it right, or you're concerned they'll lose interest in the hobby? Like, what is it about that? Or do you think I'm completely off the mark with that?
I just did it to you. No,
that was a good one.
I am not a track plan guru. I'm not, Lance Mindheim. I'm not a Byron Henderson. I'm not, Bill Neal. Not Don Mitchell. Certainly not John Armstrong. But there's certain fundamental things that I look for in a track plan. And for example, if you're going down a peninsula towards the neck of the peninsula and the railroad cuts through the peninsula to the other side of the peninsula, that strands the operator at the bottom of the peninsula aisle. And now he's got to run all the way back down the other end of the peninsula around the blob end and all the way down the other end of the aisle to catch up with his train. So if there's anything like that I spot, I'm going to tell them that's a problem. You need to find a way around that, because what's going to happen is that your crews aren't going to follow the train. They're going to learn that that's a dead end, and they're going to stand at the blob end of the peninsula and watch their trains disappear down the aisle and go in the tunnel and come out the other end. They're not going to follow the train. And that's a mortal sin, because the whole idea was a walk-around design to start with. And so if I see something like that's going to bite you in the butt, and I'm aware of it, I'm going to tell you about it. I would hope that I would do it in a constructive way. I don't think I've done it enough times to build a reputation one way or the other in that regard. But if I see it, I'm going to tell you.
Yeah, I would say you get to the point, because you have you're very passionate about all the work you've done. I mean, oh my God, you've done so much for the hobby, and you've been so connected to the hobby. I think if you see somebody that you appreciate, they're trying to get it right, you'll tell them, because you want them to get it right, rather than have them go to all the work and you'll make your, I never felt like I had to do it Tony's way. I always felt like Tony was just trying to pitch in and give his opinion in case he was right, that kind of thing. I never.
Yeah, well, and I definitely think that, Tony coming at it from an operation design point of view, it's not just a diorama that works. This is actually, you're trying to replicate railroading with that important ing at the end, which, I've talked to both of you guys about over time. And I think that, that's one of the tough things about the OC, is that you try and squeeze the like a cutoff in a vase with this size, and it's a trunk line. There's certain things you just have to come to grips with, because it is what it is. There's only so much you can do. So it's not that you have to work through some of the stuff, but I think where Tony's coming from with, advice like that, where the train goes through the peninsula and disappears, if you can avoid it, and if you can redesign a track plan, which is just paper and time, it's worth thinking about it and worth trying to avoid it. And I think that's because the goal is to make the layout fun to operate. That's how you make the layout last a long time.
Yep.
Is to have it fun to operate. And Tony's been very consistent with that advice, I think, over the years. And, Lionel, in your way, you have too. You're not a paperwork guy. And that's an important point, because there's a lot of railroaders out there that aren't paperwork guys too. And paperwork has to be understandable. It has to be accessible. It has to be not too much to still have fun on your model railroad. So it's a balancing act. And I think, it's not unlike some of the advice I think Tony has with track planning. But I think the experience of the operations carries a lot of weight with Tony's advice.
Bear in mind that I screwed up the track plan for the nickel plate. I did the Midland Road track plan, and I was happy with it right to the end. But the nickel plate track plan was not good at all. And Frank Hodina stepped in and said, let me do it, and batted it right out of the park. So you got to take advice of others. You can't just think even if you do this for a living, so to speak, as an editor of Model Railroad magazine, doesn't mean that you know everything that you're supposed to know.
No, you got to let the experts be the experts sometimes.
Yep.
I think that's a really important idea. And you mentioned the steam engine. I'm guessing that's down with Tom Schmieder.
Yes.
Yeah, Tom's another guy that just an unbelievable mechanical mind. Lives in Long Valley, the town I grew up in. I met him through Tony and Jerry Diedzik, and he's become a close friend and just a gifted guy when it comes to the mechanical side of things.
Yeah, that's very cool.
Small world, yeah.
So, Dave, I have a question I want to ask Tony, but I thought I'd run it past you first. Try not to pay attention, Tony, for a second. So, Dave, Dave. I feel like we've managed to pretty much cover from infancy to today as far as his work in model railroad publishing and through the years and everything he's done. I think we've pretty much covered that. Do you feel like we've?
Yeah, I think we got a resume.
Yeah,
I think we've seen the full. If you were to read about Tony Koester in an article from start to finish, I think we've got a pretty good picture of where he is. Yep.
We even discovered there's like 40 or 50 trains of thought somewhere buried deep in the annals of annals of Kronbach. Yes. Yeah, I shouldn't really have a podcast.
I was going to say, don't you have a podcast?
Yeah. I shouldn't be allowed to talk. Really, I mean that's pretty much where we're at. There's going to be people that listen to this because Tony's on. They will never listen to it before, and they're going to be going, "Who is that Goomba?"
That may be, yeah. But it's an introduction, and for those listeners, there's a lot of fascinating stuff out here. Although I have to admit, to be able to listen to you guys talk about it I'm learning a lot. This is fascinating stuff.
So, anyways, I want to ask Tony. We've got these two. We've got the whole timeline in now, but we still want to have him and Tony Cook, the editor of Model Railroad News, on because we want to tell all Jim Boyd stories. And Tony is doing a book with Right River Productions about Jim Boyd's night photography. So we want to talk about that.
Cool.
And then the other thing I think we should do is have another podcast where the listeners get to ask questions of Tony, where we'll put it out on the AML Facebook page and they can write in their questions and then we'll ask Tony those questions. So
sounds like fun.
So the question I want to ask Tony is, would he do this podcast 2 more times? Do you think I should ask him or what?
Yeah.
All right.
I think I don't know. It seems to me like we're all having fun.
We can do that.
All right. That's perfect. That's what we'll do. Dave, can you give, hang on a minute. So do you feel, Tony, like there's anything you wanted to add to this particular episode or?
No, I think we really haven't talked about the nickel plate in detail at all, so maybe the readers will have questions about that.
Yeah, that's right. That was the one thing maybe we'll end up doing it even more. So we'll, depending on how long but I got a feeling there's a ton of Jim Boyd stories. I got a feeling that's going to take us quite a while to get
another iconic name. Yeah.
Oh my God. And the photography that guy took, it's just,
he was, what rail fan doesn't have a couple of those books? I probably have 4 books with Jim Boyd's photographs. Yeah, and as a kid, some of my favorite Rio Grande pictures. But how does a guy have Mopac pictures, Rio Grande pictures, and then pictures in Johnstown, Pennsylvania, and New Jersey? Who is this guy? And, well, it's Jim Boyd. So I can't wait to talk about that. That's going to be fun.
And you met him at Karsten's, right, Tony?
No, I met him back in Illinois. He was an EMD field tech. And so that's how he got all those pictures. The EMD sent him all over the country to deliver new diesels. And then that job went away and he became an IC brakeman. But before he did any of that, he was a videographer for a television station. And so he has quite a varied background. And I have stories that'll probably leave you laughing your ribs out of the rib cage, because between him tangling with snakes and other things, we had quite a few years together, traveling together, so we had some great times, even a week out in the North Atlantic in a submarine together.
It's a great hobby. This is a great hobby.
Such a treasure trove of information. All right, Dave, can you give out our email address?
Yes, it is modeler'slife@gmail.com, and that's modeler'slife, which is spelled a certain way. It's one L, like track plan, not two L's like Allegheny.
That's brilliant. You hit that out of the park, too. Where do you come up with this stuff?
I got a chip, a bird on the shoulder, right? A bird on the shoulder, a chip in the pan.
Chip in the pan?
Yeah, I don't know.
Seriously, Tony, what's Dave like in real life? Like, I've actually never met him in real life. He's invited me down a few times, and I'm like, oh, geez, I just remembered I got to wash my hair. What's Dave like in real life, Tony?
He's quiet. He hardly ever speaks.
Even when Tony was here, I don't think I opened my mouth once.
Yeah, there you go.
I kept quiet.
How far apart are you guys by mileage?
You don't have miles in New Jersey. It's time. And what is it, Dave, an hour?
I would say it's about an hour. Yeah, between 50 minutes and an hour. As the crow flies, it's probably 35 miles, but it's 35 up and down miles over four little mini mountain ranges, we call them in New Jersey, up and down the hills. So there's no real direct way to do it that's fast. So you kind of have to pick your way along.
It's hard to get around Nutri. It's very difficult to get around.
Yeah, you got to know what you're doing. That's for sure.
Yeah. Okay. So we're gonna do this again, and the next time we're gonna hopefully talk to Tony Cook, or we'll take questions, however the timing works out, and then we're gonna have Jim Boyd's story. So we got those two coming up for sure. And now, Tony, do you remember what you have to say? Or we have a website, modeler'slife.com. If you go there and you scroll down, you can see if you have email you want to send us about these podcasts. You can also scroll. Dave's given out our email address, but you can also scroll down, and there's a picture of our moderately agitated mailboy. And also, if you go to Midwest Model Railroad, and it's midwestmodelrr.com, and you scroll across the navigation bar and click on AML, boom, it takes you to a wonderland of AML merchandise, hats, hoodies, T-shirts, mugs. Have you gotten your AML hoodie yet, Tony?
No.
Do you wear T-shirts? You don't seem like a T-shirt kind of guy to me. You seem more like a golf shirt kind of guy.
Yeah, that's about the size of it.
Yeah, we're gonna have to make an AML polo shirt that we can give one of those, Tony.
I think a lot of people would like one of those, actually.
Yeah. Okay, Dave. This is classic Lionel. Are you ready? Are you ready for this, Dave?
Sure. Here we go.
Tony, what size shirt do you take?
Large.
Oh, you like them skin tight, do you?
I'm down to 200 pounds. I think large will fit.
Now, Dave, that put Dave on silence. I can't believe he just said that.
Yeah. Sometimes you just got to shake your head, you know.
Come on.
You can see it. It's okay.
That's a great guy's joke. That is a great joke between guys.
I agree.
And Tony can take it. Tony's used to me, for crying out loud. I think we've known each other now for at least 30 years. I don't remember when that convention was. That might have been the first time we actually spent quality time together. So it's pretty much 30 years, Tony and I. I think we've covered it all. So, Tony, are you ready for the end? Do you remember what you have to say?
Yeah, happy rails to you.
Yeah, but not yet. You got to wait for the appropriate moment.
Oh, okay.
Well, Tony, as we close the barn doors on another episode of A Modeler's Life, and the sun slowly sets over the back 40, I guess there's nothing else left to do except for you to say,
happy rails to you.
Joe and Busted Knuckle, guests of a Modeler's Life podcast, stay at the Casa del Sol Motor Court and Inn, where late-night dancing at the Rumba Room is a magical event to be experienced.
It's another Lincoln Homer.